Hello, and welcome to this vlog about game development. This is sort of the first one which actually covers my game development career in any way. And I'd like to start by talking about uh, the first f fully finished game that I ever made, which is what you can see here in the in the picture surrounding me. It is a game called Untrodden Lands, and it's a kind of fantasy adventure game with a hint of rogue, if you like, um, meaning similar to the roguelike genre of games. I say finished, although I still tinker with it uh, now and again. So in this short, I don't know if it's going to be short, but probably not very long vlog, I'll cover what the game is, um, what the original idea was, and one thing which I've been asked to cover about it, which is how I handled random number generation. If I think of anything else during the video, I'll talk about that then. And if you have questions about the game, things you wonder, how I did or why I chose to do it that way, then you can just ask me in the comment section. I might cover a few more subjects if something comes into my mind as I'm talking. But for now, let's get started with the idea. I made this game in last year, starting in, was it in springtime? Yes, it was. And my original idea was to make a rather simple program um, to play during live streams, and it was supposed to be interactive. So the original design was meant to be a very simple game which would require minimal input, and the input would be that my viewers would write instructions to me in stream, and I would give those, relay those instructions to the game, and we'd see what happens. So originally it was supposed to be a very automated affair. Let me now move myself a little bit and turn on another camera feed so I can draw some or show you an instructional drawing, instructive drawing. Here we are. Something I very quickly cobbled together um, just before the stream. This was my original idea, basically. Um, you create a character, much like in any RPG or such action RPG or RPG, by telling me what kinds of skills it's supposed to have, from a selection, obviously, or maybe just how to distribute skill points and such. And then I imagined it at first to be completely automated, so that the character would then move from A to B, and on every step, and there was supposed to be about 3 or 4 of them. Something would happen. A randomized event would occur, but it would not require more input from the player. It would just happen, and the outcome would be decided by how you had created your character. And depending on how that went, your character might be harmed, maybe pick up some treasure, or or outright die. So it would be interesting to see how far your character got, and if it reached the goal, with how many points or how much gold or whatever. And we would have a high score list. Uh, that was my vision, so that people who were frequently in the stream chat uh, would have their character. And if it survived, I thought maybe we can update the game so that that same character can go again and maybe get some little upgrade, like a level up. Well, this um, this version never existed because as soon as I was programming, found myself programming movement in the game, or just a grid and input, I immediately programmed what you see here to my right, to my left for you. That grid um, gridded map was introduced almost immediately, and from the start the game was just that. Damn, this is not just that up there. Let me move myself so I can point directly to it. Just this thing, and you can see the character up in the top left. And originally the game was just a 5x5 square map, and in the lower right corner there would be a town, and that was your goal. To get there. The first version that was played, and which was played online, some people have played it in stream chat. It worked in the way that I don't think you got to choose any kind of skills or skill point distribution first. You just had a character, not this one, another one, and you had to move and choose your way. What existed immediately was that you can see that there are different kinds of tiles, and the different tiles represent different terrain, and different terrain would require different amounts of rations to travel through. So you had a set amount of rations, and you would have to choose a path, which would which would allow you to get through without starving. And secondly, every time you stepped on a tile, you would either encounter a spirit shrine, which would heal you, or you would encounter bandits, which would rob you. Who would rob you? I don't remember if there was a third. I don't think there was a third kind of encounter. Possibly there was the possibility of not encountering anything, but I think I think you always ended up meeting some kind of either positive or negative occurrence. People actually enjoyed playing that a bit on stream because it was simple enough. The only thing they had to tell me was to walk which direction to walk for the next step, left, right, up, or down. So it was simple, but I enjoyed making that a lot. It was my first truly graphical game. The graphics are extremely simple. It's just bitmaps that I made in my art program, which I don't remember now which I made first, of the art program or this game. I believe I made the art program first and then used it to create all the graphics. Yes, I'm 99% sure of it. I do know that all the graphics I used were created in the art program. So they're just bitmaps, which is a kind of image file. Well, it grew, I'd say almost weekly, and I added more and more features. I added, well, first I think I just added did I add more events? Truly, I can't remember exactly. What happened at least was that I added more kinds of players. So the one you see here is a so-called Bartron. The whole game is actually set in the same fantasy world as my fantasy novella. So there was a connection. It's it's a theme that I use. My fantasy world that I create in my novella is also one that I use in my paintings and in my game, at least this one, to create a sort of as a to to achieve cohesion in all my, or most at least, of my creative efforts. I like that. It was an idea I came up with a few years back, and it's really made my creative process more interesting. That feeling that I'm adding to a to a whole every time I create something new, and it also allows me to use the things I've created as an established rule base, or if you like, something to guide me. It also means that I have to be sort of careful when I create something new, because I don't want to add something that I later regret. I want everything I create to be what would you say, to fit with the world, with that specific world, and work within it, not offset any balance of aesthetics or power or whatever. It should work in the stories. It should work in the paintings and the games and so on. Anyway, as I said, I added more characters, more species or races, if you like, until there were 5, all taken from a novella. Although there are humans and dwarves, which are staples of fantasy, but the other 3 are slightly more unique, at least, such as the Bartrons here, which are kind of amphibious type. And then I also added more events, like apart from being robbed and finding spirit shrines, you could encounter bad weather and such. And I also added a certain amount of interactivity. So every time you encountered an event, you'd have a choice. Like if you were robbed, you could choose to try and run away, or you could you could choose to fight, or you could or could choose to give up and just basically hand over some amount or all of your belongings. And the outcome would then depend on your or your statistics. As you can see above me there's a bit of text. It talks about rations and health and intelligence and reputation and flexibility and all that. Do I still have reputation in the game? This is an old screenshot, but it's not that old actually. I can tell. I don't think reputation has. Oh yes, no wait, it does actually have a a use in the game, although I haven't taken note of it for a long time. Yes, so every time you run into an event, um, you'd you'd have to make a choice. And of course, for that to be meaningful, I made it so that the different species had different kinds of statistics. And within the species, whether you chose male or female would also alter your statistics a bit. And then I added gear that you could buy, and I added more interactivity with the events. And the idea grew and grew in my mind as I was programming, so that the challenge grew from being not just that of reaching the other end of the map, but also surviving and finding gold, or amassing riches rather. It's a very basic game, but it became much more sophisticated than I had anticipated. And I think I mentioned in another video that I had, compared to this, the original little oh come on, that's just blank paper, white slate, never mind. Compared to this original, the idea, my grandest vision was really very ambitious. I had an idea of including locations on the map that you could explore in turn. So if you went into a location, there could be, huts in the wilderness, maybe castles or towers where powerful wizards or lords would live, and caves that you could explore, and there would be encounters there. I usually say that the end product is about 30% of my grandest vision, but it is many hundreds of percents greater than the first vision, which was a super simple sort of game. In the end, the game became too involved to be played over stream chat. People were much less enthusiastic to play as the game grew in sophistication, because it required so much input. I still think you can, because it's completely turn-based. You never need to take any immediate action. You can always consider your options and such. But there are certainly aspects of the game that require quite a lot of input. For example, when you get attacked by wild animals and you have to sort of run away from them and lure them away by throwing food on the ground, or attack them with magic or weapons. It's as close to an action game as I've programmed, although it's not really action. Well then, perhaps most interesting part of the game from the beginning, and especially in the beginning, it became so sophisticated in the end that this might not be so important still, but it's still quite a large part of the game, and that is the randomness of it. Quite a lot is random. The map you see with those tiles, that's, I can't say completely random, but it is very random. Every time you run into something out in the wilderness, there is a randomness to it. You can dig for gold everywhere, but there's gold deposits, or I call them mineral deposits, are randomly distributed every time you get to a new section, a new map. How tough your opponents are is randomly generated. How many wild beasts you run into is randomly generated. How poisonous certain plants are, or how rare they are. These things are also randomly generated. Picking rare plants can earn you quite a lot of cash, but it can also be risky because you can get poisoned just by touching them. The intensity of weather that you run into is also random. And when you do that, when you run into bad weather, you have to seek shelter, and that brings up a little mini map, which is also randomly generated, in which you can find different so say combinations of, I guess, vegetation or cover from the wind and rain and such. I'm quite happy with how it turned out, but let me go into detail about how I generated random numbers, since it's such an important part of the game. At first, this was done by generating a new random number every time I needed one, and this was done by taking a reading from the system clock. And if you don't know, a computer processor runs a certain number of cycles per second, in the millions or sometimes billions, and by asking the computer to tell you how many cycles it has run at any given time, it will give you that number, and it will go from 0 to however many cycles it's set to run, and then it will reset. sometimes you can just add them up as well. Well, I did that, and then I took the number, however large it was, and I picked the last digit, the single value digit, which is obviously somewhere between 0 and 9. And that would be my random number. And then I would sort of juggle, as I said, that number. So I even to generate the entire map, I used one number. And I did that by running it through an algorithm that would multiply it by a certain number. And once, and then as it did that, the number with which it was multiplied would be added to, and the next time it went through the algorithm, it would what you would do for every tile, for example, on the map, it would be multiplied by another number. So every other round it would be multiplied by a different number, and that number would be there would be an addition to that number to both those alternating numbers, or I should perhaps say values. Maybe I should illustrate a bit. If you imagine I have my number of 5 there, and it comes into the, let's say the algorithm is this box. It comes in here, and if it's even, let's just call them even and uneven. Even cycle there and uneven cycle there. If it's an even cycle, it would go here and be multiplied by 3. So we would get 15 out here. And then the next time it would, and this would then, the algorithm would then switch, trigger a switch, so that the next time it went through, it would go to the uneven one. Also, this number would be added to. I think I used different numbers, but perhaps I would add 7 to it, so it would become a 10. And over here would be a 5, maybe. And it would go through here, and then 5 would be multiplied by 5, so I'd get a 25 next time. And that number would also be, a 7 would be added to that number as it came out here. So I would have 12 instead. Excuse the messiness here. So, and then of course this would repeat. It would alternate every time, and these two numbers would grow gradually. And once they reached a certain amount, they would reset. Or in some cases, I tinkered with this algorithm quite a lot. So sometimes I would just divide them by something, by 10 or by a percentage of themselves, like 10. So maybe they would as soon as they reached, let's say, over 300. So it wasn't a specific number because I wouldn't know that they would reach a specific number. But if they reached over 300, then it would be divided by 10% of itself or something like that. So let's say it reached 357, it would be then divided by 35.7%, or multiplied by 0.35 or 357, and so on and so forth. So using only one number, I could generate quite a lot of different numbers. But then a friend of mine, a very good friend, who is a professional coder and software developer, and who's been coaching me a bit, quite a lot, on basic programming principles. He noted that, yes, well, even so, using this, you would get like a maximum of 20 different combinations, at least from the beginning, or for any given thing, really. And of course he was right. And I noted that I knew that some maps would come again. They would be recurring maps. So I thought, well, how do I make that better? I didn't mind hugely because it was still a good selection, of course, and the further you got into the game, of course, these numbers would change quite a lot, as they would, they would be the same from the beginning, but they would eventually become very mixed or very, very unpredictable. But the beginning of the game was if not predictable, then at least not all that surprising. So and I just wanted to learn to make a better random number generator, and I was inspired by a video about Doom, the old game from the early 90s, in which in which a person was talking about how random numbers were generated in that game, and they apparently had a list of 255 or so values, which which were spread out. So they were not 0 to 255. They were a bit, spread out. So it might be 9, 140, 65, etc., etc., etc. But and every time the game would need a new number, it would just go through this list, and that as it came to the end, it would loop back. Doom uses so many random numbers all the time that there's no way you can predict which number is going to come out, even if see, oh, you notice how much damage you took, for example, because damage is randomized to some certain extent. So many things use random numbers in that game that it doesn't matter. They can use that same list all the time, but because in the more intense moments of that game, which there are quite a lot of, because it's an action FPS, there would be, I guess, hundreds of random numbers used every second or every few seconds at least. Maybe not hundreds, but dozens. Well, I thought I like I could do something similar, but I didn't want to build a list like they had. I didn't feel that was necessary. Not I did, or rather, I didn't want to copy the exact same method. I wanted to come up with something that was sort of my own. So what I did, and this is the random number generator that the game still uses, is that at certain keystrokes in the game, so not every keystroke you make in the game, but quite a lot of them, the game will activate a piece of code that reads a number from the system clock, just like I explained earlier, which is a number between 0 and 9. But instead of just using it immediately, it saves it in a list, which starts at 0. Well, I don't mean that the list starts at 0 every time. That's not the first number. I mean that the list is empty when you start the game. But before you get into the game, even if you load a character immediately, which is the fastest way to get into to a new game, requires the fewest key presses, like 4 maybe, or so. It will have already generated 4 numbers. And so basically I use the same method here, but I also iterate through that list, which is growing all the time. So doing this just every time, changing the number here. So even if you just have a list of 4 different numbers, that suddenly becomes, if you had a variation of 10 to begin with here, that's multiplied by 4 at the very least. So you have at least like 40 maps possible. And actually, since if you load a character, you also load a map, that's not really possible. So, and you have to create a new character to get a new random map. And to create a new character, you have to make quite a few more key presses. So you'd be at a minimum of 10 or so. And obviously then you have, I guess, 100 or 200 possible map combinations, and probably more that can occur. And the game keeps building this. When the list has 300 numbers, so as not to grow stale, it deletes the first 100 of that list, and then fills and lets you fill in the next, fill it in again until it reaches 300 the next time, and then it does that over and over. So the list doesn't grow to become huge, and it's never the same. It keeps changing all the time. Now, if you load a new game, the list will also, every time you start the game, the list will be empty. So if you load an old character, then you will start building your list again. But it builds so fast that it really doesn't matter much. I'm very happy with this method, and it works for this game. I'm thinking that I would probably do something like Doom, or a mix. Like I would have a pre-made list for my next game that uses random numbers. I would probably have a pre-made list of 200 or so numbers, or maybe 300. But then I might actually do the same thing, that let's say that if it starts at 200 and then reaches 300, then it will start. It will delete some of the first numbers and start filling itself in again. I like that idea. It keeps the game fresh and truly random. In that you could theoretically end up with a list that has just nines in it, for example. And I guess you might notice that. It's extremely unlikely, but it's possible. I mean, the reason why they did what they did in Doom is probably because they wanted a dispersion, they wanted a variety, and they wanted a guaranteed variety. It's something I read about game development, that often random number generation in games is actually quite controlled. So you say they had the example that you have a magical trinket that absorbs damage one time out of 10. Now you could have it truly randomly generated. There's a 10% chance that it will absorb damage, but if it's truly randomly generated, that means there's also a quite great chance that it will never absorb any damage, because it's a 10% chance every time, and the probability doesn't increase. So instead, they would probably go like, it is guaranteed to absorb damage once every 10 uses. You just don't know which one of those 10. That would give the impression of it. That would actually make it sort of a guaranteed success 10% out of the time, out of all times. But uh, it will feel to the player as it's very random, because you might have a success 3 times in a row, but then I guess the ratio, or the possibility of it succeeding will decrease for a while, and you might have 20 times when it doesn't work at all. I'm not familiar with how other game developers do it. I just know that it's often very controlled, and it's a very interesting field, I think, which I look forward to dabble in more, especially when it comes to building artificial intelligences for opponents or NPCs, in deciding, in simulating their decisions, steering them, and also giving them some leeway, making them seem alive or unpredictable. Anyway, uh, that was my current best take on random number generation, and this is the game. I will demonstrate how it works. Um, I won't do it in this video, because then I think that's going to be a very long video. Because even though it's a rather simple game, compared to most games we have, at least commercial, should we say, full price games of today. There are many mobile games and free games and such that are much simpler than this. But out of full price games, I don't think this can compare, or possibly it can compare with the lower end of the scale. As I've said before, I want to offer it as a free download on my homepage. I'll try to make that happen in this coming week. And if I can, I will announce it, of course. Yes, I think that's it for the moment. If you have questions about the game in any form, please put that in a comment below, and I'll either address it in the comments or in an upcoming video on this game. I think I'll probably make 1 or 2 more videos about this. At least one, just as a user's manual, how to play the game, and possibly something more about the technicalities of it, or my thoughts on the design, maybe some specifics of the design. Yeah, that's it. I hope you find this interesting and that you will tune in for more content like this. I will make videos about my other game as well, and then the videos will be about the things that I'm currently developing. Okay, with that, I wish you a good time of day, and goodbye.